pentagram dedicated to Henry Foreman. In the years of the primal force and the dawn of terrestrial birth,
He talks about philosophy, says my mother. Oh, really? I reply. It seemed like a bit of a dig, although I can't quite be sure. Yeah, he talks about philosophy on his podcast. He's very good, you know. Maybe you should listen to it, says my mother. Who's she talking about? Fucking Blindboy. Blindboy. Seemed like a little bit of a dig, as if my mother had been listening to the 220-something previous episodes of Agitators Anonymous and thought, you know what? He's not really discussing philosophy enough. Well, you may or you may not know Blindboy. His podcast is pretty good, although I do find the shtick of the plastic bag over the face and the accent a bit grating by now. Quite odd to move into middle age, still wearing all the get-up. But having said that, I've been wearing makeup for 34 years, so really I'm probably not in a position to criticize anyone for any of those kind of affectations. Well, Agitators Anonymous, my friends. What are we going to talk about today? I'm going to talk a bit about the hate speech bill in Ireland, which has been shelved. Finally, some common sense has prevailed. I'll waffle a little bit about that later on. But I am actually going to try and discuss a little bit of philosophy, because aside from my mother's little dig in the ribs about, well, you don't really discuss much philosophy, do you? I'm going to talk about liberty, but more specifically, libertarianism. It's a word that I don't remember hearing very often 10, 20 years ago, or much in the 90s. What a classical liberal is, because you hear it quite a lot now, and I'm not sure that sometimes it gets the examination that it requires, or the understanding it requires. So I'm going to take a little look at what it means to be a classical liberal, because I find many of the classical liberal positions are things that resonate within me. Maybe they do with you, and you don't know that you are one. Let's examine that. My friends, Agitators Anonymous. So before we get into the episode, as ever, the podcast is sponsored by Metal Blade Records, the home of Primordial. So you can go to www.metalblade.indiemerch.com, INDIE, metalblade.indiemerch.com, and you can use the code AA2024, and then you type 10% off, and you can get 10% off your order. It is the home of Show No Mercy, Hell Awaits, Cannibal Corpse, Fate's Warning, Merciful Fate, Primordial, tons and tons of bands, Sirith Ungol. The list is endless. Times are tough, and that 10% off can mean an awful lot. And this is the only metal label that is still independent. Right then, now back to the episode. Let's get a little bit of housekeeping out of the way. You can follow me on Nemthianka_Primordial on Instagram, Primordial_official, if you want to find out a bit more about the band. You can follow me, or rather, you can go over to my patreon.com/Alan Averill and join that if you want. There's discussions, all sorts of things, some demos of songs nobody's ever heard. You know the kind of thing that goes on there. Go over and have a look. So during lockdown, I had a bit of a discussion with a very good friend of mine, and I said, I think the most important word in the English language is liberty, as in the word that has the most weight, importance. And he said, no, it's love. And I thought about that for a moment. And of course, reaching for the hammer when it comes to arguing, sometimes, as is my wont, you reach for the most destructive example to prove the most extreme point of view. And I said, yeah, well, what if you love pedophilia? What if you love, let's pick something particularly evil and heinous. What if you love rape? What if you love stabbing people? And he kind of looked at me and went, right, you had to go there, didn't you? But I felt like I kind of did, you know. I mean, if you've ever had a discussion with me over more than 3 or 4 beers, you probably have noticed my unwillingness to always adhere to the etiquette of arguing in that sense. And I think I did have a point. Liberty, though, is something everyone has aspired to. Every nation that's been in chains, enslaved, oppressed, every person aspires to the notions of liberty. It's, with liberty and freedom for all. It's in the American Constitution. It's égalité, fraternité, liberté. It's in these 3 words that the French Republic was declared. It's a huge word with a great sense of weight. And like I said at the top, you've probably noticed there are people who, the disintegration of what was considered the Libertarian Party in the United States it's not been really a big news story, but slowly but surely this incredible infighting seems to have destroyed this small third party. And let's be clear, if you live in a country that has a 2-party system, it's not in their interest to open that up to a third party. It's why you get things like Farage in the UK getting millions of votes and then 2 seats. Now, some of you may think that that's a good idea, but it's hardly democratic, really, is it? When in certain political structures, someone could go and get millions of votes. In the UK, for example, you could get millions of votes, but come in at 49% in every single seat and come second and therefore have no seats. And this has always been the problem, I think, in a 2-party system. But those systems are, by and large, old. I mean, a good example is the American system. Neither of those Republicans or Democrats are going to allow a third-party alternative. And the reality is that a third-party alternative that maybe is less extreme or doesn't go as far or maybe even makes more common sense than either the Democrats or the Republicans, which, let's be honest, might not be that hard, will be seen as a vote taker, as a general negatory and negative element in the system that's detracting from the overall message. And if you vote for, let's say, RFK, before he came in under Trump, let's say RFK, who was getting some traction, let's say he went, I have a third way. People would say to him, yeah, but you realize by creating that third way and taking a couple of million votes, you're taking them away from the potentiality of the Democrats beating the Republicans beating the Democrat in that particular state. So it's a very complicated and I suppose salutary lesson in what seems democratic and not. Now, this may seem pretty ridiculous, and I realize it's ridiculous before I've even said it, but what got me thinking about this was also a conversation I was having at the weekend. Primordial just played some gigs in Germany, and I was giving out about my phone. Look. And it was the fact that my phone is constantly now advising me about things. It's saying, turn down the volume. Hey, you don't need to listen to music or whatever it is that loud. Turn down the volume. And that really, somehow, really pisses me off. Now, it sounds so trite and so ridiculous, but it got me thinking about this idea that I'd been having about Isaiah Berlin, and this is the idea of negative and positive liberty. Now, I'll get to that in a moment. From small acorns, great things grow, and it may seem like the most mundane observation, but somehow it seemed at this moment, because I was tired, don't forget, I'd come through an airport, little sleep, bit tired and cranky, and I was like, look, to my phone, if I want to make myself deaf, it's my fucking choice, not yours, to my phone. Those kind of conversations. And then Siri springs into life and says, excuse me, as you've said the F word or whatever it is. Or, your message is being sent off to some data center somewhere. But I suppose the most famous and influential text on liberty is John Stuart Mill on liberty, which is 1859. And I suppose the most famous quote is this: the only freedom which deserves the name is that of pursuing our own good in our own way, so long as we do not attempt to deprive others of theirs or impede their efforts to obtain it. This quote reflects Mill's central argument. Individuals should be free to make their own choices in life as long as those choices do not harm others. It emphasizes the principle of individual liberty and the idea of harm prevention as the only legitimate reason for government intervention. Do what thou willst, as long as it doesn't harm others. But as I begin to talk about these things and the conversation begin to flow from that dumb argument with my phone, and it grew into a conversation about the nanny state and the overreach of modern politics, which, let's be fair, we can take something that's happened in recent memory, such as the lockdown, which, was a huge governmental overreach. I've laid out my ideas about it before on the podcast. I think initially it had, some medical weight and confusion to it, but it became pretty quickly a political decision, not a medical decision. You can agree or disagree if you wish, but that was my observation. And I said to people at the time, this is going to go on for years. In fact, it's well documented within this podcast. And people said to me, you're crazy, you're insane. I went, no, just watch. Because institutions of power and government institutions, platforms of technical oligarchy, whatever you want to say, technocratic institutions are going to use this to overreach into all of our lives and infringe on the most important word in the English language, your liberty. So let's consider what classical liberalism is. Classical liberalism as a political and economic ideology, it really emphasizes individual liberty. And you'll see when I outline some of these things how something like what happened during lockdown or some of the more modern movements, we can call them even collectivization, which in a sense is forms of socialism, how they are at odds with each other. But it emerged in the 18th and 19th centuries and largely influenced by the Enlightenment. Thinkers like John Locke, Adam Smith and John Stuart Mill. Now you consider in recent times there's been a sort of a kind of war waged on what the Enlightenment means because it's seen as a white European movement, and therefore among certain sections of academia and society it's kind of demonized. But that's where it came from, the Enlightenment. Maybe I should do a podcast also about the Enlightenment, but let's not get sidetracked too much. And the key principles of classical liberalism, which I find resonate very much with myself, are individual rights and freedom. And the classic view is really the importance of individual rights, which are freedom of speech, religion, and association. An association can mean the rights of a group to protest. Remember how that was limited during lockdown, that kind of thing. They emphasize personal responsibility and autonomy. You're the king of your own castle, so to speak. Limited government, and this is something that's very important to the principles of classical liberalism. Limited government. The role of the government should be restricted to protecting individuals' rights, enforcing contracts between people, and ensuring national defense. Realistically, kind of staying out of people's lives, which is what I suppose you could say the original American model of government was. And then you look at that compared to the Russian model, which was micromanaging everything down to how many toothbrushes were produced. Every single thing. Obviously, except the things you want and desire, are taken care of by the system and the structure. So you can see the differences already. The classical liberalism stands opposed to communism, really. Government intervention in economic and personal affairs should be minimal. Free markets. Now here's where there's quite a lot of arguing about this. Now I would have said free market, not an unregulated free market as what happened in the 1990s as it kind of came untethered completely from the state. But the classical liberal position is to advocate for a free market economy where competition on voluntary exchanges drive innovation, which will drive wealth creation and efficiency. Now, you can say that's kind of idealistic, but I mean, look, all of these things have relative idealism in them. But the classical liberal position is to oppose bureaucracy, also to oppose monopolies. And you look around the world that we're in now, look at these huge companies that seem to have hollowed out the nation state. The Facebooks, the Amazons. The classical liberal position would be to be opposed to that. And government-controlled economies, which is where we return to the socialist concept. The rule of law. Everyone, including government officials, I mean, the principle is that everyone is subject to the same overarching law, and it shouldn't be different for people of positions of state than those who are just, your average person within society. The law should be predictable, and I suppose you could say it's the classical liberal position is coming out of the era of monarchy, out of the era of the divine right of inheritance and the medieval age, the power of the church, all that kind of thing, in a way similar to where Marx and Engels and all these kind of people were reacting against that same system. It's just one kind of veered into a more collectivist ideal and the other veered into a more individual ideal. Private property, which is a massive thing. And, as we've discussed on the podcast, you will own nothing and you will be happy. Which, of course, an awful lot of people who would like to portray, I think the truth is in the middle about the World Economic Forum and all these kind of things, is that it can be easy to get too excited about it, but it can also be, foolhardy to underestimate the idea that the world's richest people get in a room together and do what they do and underestimate their influence. An example of this would be, there's a podcast I listened to called Things Fell Apart with the very likeable and affable John Ronson. A very amenable, clever, witty guy. He wrote The Men Who Stare at Goats and all sorts of other things. But in the podcast, it's a couple of seasons now, he tries to diffuse and explain things that have become conspiracy theories. And by and large, their origins are far more mundane than the people who tend to overblow them would like to believe. And there's a moment during a Q&A where a woman says to him about the World Economic Forum and this "You Will Own Nothing and Be Happy" article that originally came out. And, she's kind of scoffed a bit by the audience as she kind of says to him, you will totally underestimate them, blah, 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 blah. Then he explains quietly about this Danish politician, this woman who wrote this "You Will Own Nothing and Be Happy" article, who said her life was ruined by the article. And it was meant as a thought experiment. And I thought, yeah, okay, so the origins of this huge concept were an article that was a thought experiment. But at the same time, I did kind of feel, and you may go and listen to the podcast, Things Fell Apart, and see what you think, that Ronson, in his kind of very disarming way, was slightly playing down the power and influence that would have been within that room. And wouldn't it be regular? Wouldn't it be normal for this woman, after all the online abuse she did get, which, let's be fair, is over the top, isn't it kind of reasonable she would understate the principles of this idea? But also the idea that all those very, very rich people who are gathered at Davos to say, look, it's just a talk shop. There's a mundane reason behind it all. Yes and no. Again, the percentage lies in the middle, I think. But private property is a very core principle of this old classical liberalism. And if you think about it, look at the success of North America compared to South America in the 20th century. And there's many reasons for it, many political reasons for that. But one of the main reasons is because the South America is the continent that has all the natural resources. North America, I think, doesn't have the same opportunity when it comes to natural resources at all. But people who went to North America, who worked off their servitude, their indentured servitude, or whatever you want to say, they had the possibility of owning land, of owning property, and taking part and growing and moving through the community. Whereas if you look at South America, you can see there are tracts of land, entire swathes of nation states that are still owned by the same Spanish family, Catholic family from the 15th and 16th centuries. And what you're looking at is North America thriving under a Protestant ethic, maybe one could say, and South America labouring under familial Catholic principles, which did not allow for slaves or indentured servitude, people working that off, to own land. So, I mean, that's a broad stretch, I think, but I think there's something there. I think there's definitely something there. So private property is part of the classical liberal ideal, which, of course, if you think about the massive state apparatus of communism, of communist states, private property and private ownership of land is one of the things they really reacted against. Look at when the Bolsheviks purging of the kulaks, the landowning class within the Soviet state, their bloody repression of anybody really who owned land. And you can see the difference in those things. And that's what's quite very surprising. Well, not really surprising, but to hear so many young people echo those sentiments, those very brutal sentiments of these massive state apparatus. But I suppose that's inherent in many of the Marxist principles. A brief aside, I was reading something somebody sent me, and my name was linked to criticism because I had been discussing the concept of cultural Marxism, which apparently is a conspiracy theory, which I found really fascinating. The idea that the influence of Marx over culture could be a conspiracy theory. Marx, one of the most important, influential writers of the last 200 years, the idea that his influence would be over culture a conspiracy. So you're not really supposed to discuss it. Anyway, I digress. Nonsense, of course, but... So from classical liberalism, if you go to libertarianism, one is the stepping stone to the other. And in reality, it expands on many of the principles of classical liberalism, but probably even focusing even more so strongly on individual liberty, again, even more limited government and personal responsibility. And I think that's one of the things that becomes very clear, is that the libertarian ideal is more about equality of opportunity, not equality of outcome, which is something that many Western countries are labouring under. The idea that you can, through regulation, enforce the same outcomes. It's kind of like forcing that square peg into the round hole. But again, the key principles of libertarianism, maybe you see yourselves in them. Individual liberty, the highest value upon individual freedom. Yeah, certainly. The belief that each person really, I suppose, has the right to live their life as they choose. A freedom of speech, thought, and lifestyle. Yeah, the libertarian principles are very much in keeping with much of the modern sexual identity principles. Libertarians certainly would have supported things like gay marriage, for example. Limited government, yep, sign me up for limited government. They believe, again, the state's only legitimate roles, I think, are to protect individuals from force, fraud and theft, national defence. But sometimes where things create a bit of a division is when you talk about welfare programs, education and healthcare. Now, this is one place where I kind of digress a bit, as I do think that welfare programs, education and healthcare should be something of a working class right, which I suppose is more of a socialist principle. It's an old left principle, which growing up in a working class city I would adhere to, instead of them being privatized or left to voluntary associations, which I think is more of a libertarian principle. So I suppose on one side, the small government, small g government, the principles of freedom of speech, association and religion, sexuality, all those kind of things are more in line with the libertarian ideals that I would identify with, but yet at the same time, the privatization of welfare, education and healthcare can lead to, I suppose, a situation like you might have in the United States, where somehow having healthcare is seen by some people as a far left ideal, which, you know, you can find these principles of the welfare state in Bismarckian Germany, which, you know, has nothing to do with any of those ideas. But leaving education and healthcare open to laissez-faire economics has its dangers. But, you know, there's a balance to be struck between those things. You don't have to take all from one and none from column B, you know. But generally, the belief is that free markets are free from government regulation or control. I think there should be some regulation and control here and there. But taxes, regulations, subsidies, I suppose, are seen fundamentally as harmful to economic growth. Now, it depends how far you take that. You could do a sort of Milton Friedmanite interpretation of that and apply some hard economics, maybe to countries like Chile. And I suppose it's a kind of sink or swim ideal. You either adapt and thrive, or you fall through the net. This is one of the main divergent paths between, I suppose, a libertarian and a collectivist principle. Personal responsibility. I mean, that's what I have been thinking about as well. Libertarians emphasize individuals are responsible for their own actions and decisions. This means freedom to make their own choices, but also bear the consequences of those choices without expecting government assistance. And if you think about, for example, the lockdown, one of the things that struck me at the time was how many people seemed really happy to be just told what to do. They were just happy that, hey, there's just one thing on the menu, I don't have any choice anymore. And seeing as I don't have to worry about any kind of social aspect, any kind of cultural aspect, any kind of artistic, anything other than this one thing, which is this sort of, you know, top-down, stay-at-home law, then I don't really have to worry about anything. It absolutely leveled the playing field on all sorts of measurements and really appealed to the collectivist mindset. It also really appealed to people who, let's be clear and let's be blunt and brutal, were maybe, you know, losing small L at life, so to speak, and the thought that no one else was doing something that they weren't able to was somehow comforting. And of course, there were many people who, when communism departed and collapsed, were left in a void. They weren't able to cope with the idea that all of a sudden you had this huge weight of personal autonomy. The libertarian principle is to reject the use of force or coercion to achieve political, social, or economic ends. Now apply that to lockdown, for example. But there's something interesting here, is that anarcho-capitalism, which we've heard an awful lot about anarchy lately, you know, connected to the Antifa and connected to far-left idealism. But anarcho-capitalism, which is a very interesting concept, it's in itself, you might have heard me discuss a few of those things with Kim, the artist, Kim Jungerholm, who came on the podcast a few months ago. This is a kind of more radical form of libertarianism that advocates the complete elimination of the state, with all functions of society, including security and law, being handled by private competing entities in a free market, not a collectivist market. So anarcho-capitalism, very interesting idea. Some principles of that really do seem to make sense as well. But you can have right libertarianism and left libertarianism. The right libertarianism sort of more focuses on economic freedom, property rights and free markets. And it can oppose welfare programs and social safety nets and regulations on business. Whereas the left libertarianism, still advocating individual freedom and limited government, the left side of libertarianism seems to be more connected or concerned with economic inequality, and sometimes supports voluntary communal arrangements or cooperative models as alternatives to capitalism. Sounds to me like there is a sweet spot between the two. And the main thinkers here, I suppose, moving classical liberalism onto libertarianism, are John Locke, Adam Smith, and John Stuart Mill. And they all kind of really preach the same thing: individual liberty, limited government, free markets and economic freedom. Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, I think, is a really famous take on this. And then you have people like Friedrich Hayek and aforementioned Milton Friedman, for whom some people he was the devil. But they built on a classical liberal economic theory, and they argue that markets should be fully free to operate without government interference. But I suppose, like all these things, you know, you can take a bit from column A and a bit from column B. You can believe that there should be healthcare, housing and education as a basic human right, but also believe in a, you know, free market ideal that backs certain elements of that, but also, especially, I think the most important for me are the freedom of speech, freedom of association, things which are non-negotiable, freedom of religion, but also the idea that government overreach is really an important thing to constantly observe and prune and trim and stop the ability of governments being able to reach into every aspect of your life. Of course, many of the books, well, all the books we're talking about, I'm not sure they ever could have imagined that you would have a device in your pocket that could be the perfect system, the perfect instrument of authoritarianism and the ideal of authoritarianism that many, many Western countries and governments are seeming to reach for, because they want to be in every aspect of people's lives. And like I said before, you know, you don't have to be a genius to realize, and look, you feel free to disagree if you want, that, for example, again, the lockdown, the pandemic and all those kind of things were a perfect example of collectivist ideas versus rubbing up against the idea of personal liberties and our freedoms. And, in my opinion, it allowed the government massive overreach into all of our lives, which, let's be clear, these things don't get returned to you as a citizen. The government doesn't kind of go, yeah, okay, so we added and we took a few more powers there, but, you know, here you go. But let's just lay it out. I mean, individual versus collective priority. I mean, like I said, the libertarian ideal emphasizes individualism, and that certainly is not something that a socialist state encourages. The idea that you could, you know, can be an individual and pursue your own goals and make your own choices, without having to conform to collective decisions or goals. The collectivist ideal, in contrast, prioritizes the needs, goals, and interests of the group or community over those of the individual, holds the well-being of the group, sometimes requires limiting individual freedoms for the greater good, as it sees it. You can see how those two things would be in big contradiction. Collectivist systems, again, like socialism or communism, they advocate for more active and powerful government or collective body to ensure equality, manage resources and organize society according to collective interests. Again, you're kind of returning to this equality of opportunity versus outcome argument. And this is one of the most dangerous things, I think personally, is that the collectivist ideal is to emphasize equality of outcome. Wealth, resources, opportunities are distributed equally across society, even if this means limiting the freedoms of some individuals to ensure fairness for the collective. I mean, theoretically, I suppose it makes some sense, but what it does is it limits successful people's ability to become successful, which can, lift or become a tide that lifts more boats, so to say. Somewhere out in the fields, tilling, maybe the greatest mathematician who ever lived, but won't get the opportunity to be that person because of the system that requires this collectivist anonymity. And of course, you can see all of this within our modern society, which is obsessed with equality, which is obsessed with equity, and equity of, it's a sort of equal outcomes of everybody. But of course, I just think that's kind of unrealistic idea, because how can that happen? People have different skills, people have different skill sets, people have different levels of application. The tragedy of the commons, this idea that there are people who do absolutely nothing who will benefit from the people in their community who will take up absolutely everything and sort of fix the commons. Should those people be not rewarded for their efforts greater than those who are willing to do nothing? Yeah, this is the constant conflict between these ideals. But it also has to be said that, fascism is also a collectivist ideology on some level. Authoritarian nationalism, which focuses on the power of the nation or state over individuals, these are also fundamentally opposed to libertarianism. Libertarians resist, I think, any system where the collective, whether that be nation or state, demands loyalty at the expense of personal liberty. So if you've been sitting here thinking, oh, this libertarian stuff sounds all a bit right-wing, that's not really true either. It fundamentally is opposed, realistically, to most elements of both left and right. And this returns me to my stupid comment about my phone, and that's the writer Isaiah Berlin, and he had this concept of negative and positive liberty, which I find really fascinating. It's in a 1958 essay called Two Concepts of Liberty. Think about this. Negative liberty is what refers to freedom from external interference, I suppose you could say. It is the absence of obstacles, barriers, or coercion that prevent an individual from doing what they want. And that might be to become a junkie and take heroin and kill yourself. And this sort of view, the negative liberty view, is that you are allowed to destroy yourself unhindered. Drink yourself to death. That is your will. You can put in to your body whatever you want. If you want to believe the earth is flat, believe the earth is flat. Whereas, as I try and understand it, positive liberty sort of refers to the idea of self-mastery or self-realization, that you are free to control your own life and achieve your potential. Positive liberty is about determining your destiny. That sounds a bit over the top, but it sort of can see that governmental programs such as improving education or healthcare or reducing poverty can be, these are elements that can be seen as enhancing your overall positive liberty, even though fundamentally, as we look back on libertarianism, the libertarian principle might be to oppose their existence, but they can actually benefit people. Berlin himself, he says, positive liberty is the wish on the part of the individual to be his own master, governed by himself or by institutions that allow him to partake in the decision-making process, which is kind of like a little bit different. One is kind of saying that you can jump off the deep end if you want, the negative liberty, and you have the liberty to destroy yourself, whereas positive liberty is standing on the platform and jumping up, but there's still a platform there. Kind of complicated, but I've been sort of mulling over it the last while. Negative liberty is the absence of interference. Positive liberty, the presence of control, I suppose, is the way you could summarize it. But also, Berlin, he kind of warned that positive liberty can be dangerous because it can be used to justify coercion in the name of freedom. And this is what echoes something greater today. Governments and rulers claim to know what's best for individuals. Hey, we've seen this recently, forcing them to act in ways that supposedly make them more free. You could see an awful lot of the digital sphere and the things we discuss now are framed in terms of our safety and we know what's best for you. This can make you more free. That's when alarm bells should ring. And individuals get oppressed in the name of their own real freedom. So again, both positive and negative liberty have theoretically good things going for it. And negative liberty can be more aligned, I suppose, with individual autonomy, and the choice is yours. Destroy yourself or don't. I suppose that's a pretty extreme example, but you can see what I mean. But Berlin, he argues that both have their place, and to be wary of both. I suppose that's the salient takeaway message. The balance is very difficult to strike, especially when you have, as we discussed, massive technocratic institutions who simply want to accrue more and more power and influence over people's lives. This is where, the language begins to get very squirrely, I think, where people are now beginning to see things like freedom of speech as a as a right-wing talking point, or you're gaslighting people, or it's like a dog whistle, when it is actually one of the most important principles of a democratic society. But your freedom of speech should be curtailed because it can cause offence. And this is what brings me to the hate speech bill in Ireland, which was thankfully defeated. I talked about it before here. I mean, the principle is, look, hate speech itself is an Orwellian dystopian concept. I don't really believe that it exists. There's hateful speech, I suppose. But I mean, what follows on from that is inevitably thought crime, I think, or pre-crime. And that's kind of where our system was going with this hate speech bill. It would have criminalized intent, and it would have placed, the idea that you are innocent till proven guilty was kind of turned on its head, and the emphasis was on you as the person accused to prove that you were not guilty. It also, and this is very dangerous indeed, it placed it really placed the power within this definition to be with the person who claims to be offended, and you have to prove that you did not offend. I mean, it's a crazy thing, and like I said, it's an Orwellian, intellectually sort of redundant, small-minded sort of attitude that, let's be honest, is framed and couched in the language of keeping you safe, but is really overreach by governments who, they kind of weaponized empathy, I think is what it is. And it's got authoritarian streaks running through it. They're riven through it. The politics of how we feelism, and the idea that they want to criminalize criticism of even its own policies. And politicians whinging about their online abuse they get. I mean, this is everyone, right? This is anyone who pokes their head above the parapet and has a position of power and says things. I mean, God damn it, there's people whinging about me on forums all over the place. It's just the idea that a politician would want to somehow criminalize criticism, or people having a go at them online. I mean, this is what all authoritarian governments reached for throughout the 20th century. And that's one of the things that's so small-minded and so short-minded. Well, it's such short-termism when you consider something like this, because maybe it's, as a politician, it's your goal to get this forced and pushed through the statute books. But what happens in 10 years or 15 years when maybe a real tyrant takes power? Because democracy is not the default setting of society, as I've said before in the podcast. And they come in and they use your law to enact very, very authoritarian, tyrannical measures against citizens. Where does that leave you then? Your legacy is you were the enabler of a much more dictatorial, authoritarian state. And that's kind of how I see it. But that itself betrays a kind of historical illiteracy on behalf of these people who are trying to push these things through. Not only is it paternalistic, and I would say almost colonial in its idealism, in that it states, hey, we must protect you, Mr. Minority, Mrs. Minority, whoever you are. We'll protect you from the bad words. And those bad words within this bill could come from the theatre. It had provisions for comedy, for music. We will keep you free from mockery, irony, sarcasm, or just a joke, because we think you are not in your right mind to be able to understand it, to be able to take a joke, to be offended. It is our duty to offend, my friends. Anyway, don't take me that seriously. I'm just a singer in a heavy metal band, waffling on. 45 minutes off the cuff I have reached. My friends, Agitators Anonymous, the clue is in the name. Agitators Anonymous. And it's just a little musing, a little waffle, a little ramble across the ideas of liberty, libertarianism, classical liberalism. And, to be quite clear, you can take a bit from column A, column B, column C, column D. Take the best bits from these things. But the classical liberal stance is opposed to the authoritarian impulses from either side. And that's the warning inherent. My friends, Agitators Anonymous, see you next week.